What's up guys, Nick here. Today, we're going to do a quick overview on the basics of how to take care of your Nepenthes. Let's get right into it. So, the first thing you should be thinking about before you buy a Nepenthes is where you live and what conditions you're able to provide, because the variety of Nepenthes you get should largely depend on what conditions you're able to provide for it. Now, there are three main varieties of Nepenthes: lowland, intermediate, and highland. Right now, let's start off with lowland. So, lowland Nepenthes, like Nepenthes bicalcarata or ampullaria, need warmer temperatures and higher humidity, and they're found in, the hot, humid jungles with lower elevation. So, they should have day temps between 84 to 88 Fahrenheit and a humidity in the 80% range, so very high humidity. They are also less forgiving to large fluctuations in temperature or humidity, so you don't want it dipping down low at night. Then you have intermediate Nepenthes. So, most hybrids are intermediate growers, which means they're also more forgiving and robust, and they're usually suited to a more variable set of conditions. So their daytime temps can be anywhere from 80 to 85 Fahrenheit, and they can even have nighttime temps in the 60s. They can also handle lower humidity, especially if you acclimate them slowly to that lower humidity, and more fluctuant temperatures. Their humidity, again, should stay high within the 70 to 80% range. However, it can be acclimated to slightly lower humidity. Then, we have highland Nepenthes. So, the highland Nepenthes actually benefit from slightly cooler temperatures in the 70s, with a nighttime drop of 15 to 20 degrees, dipping down into the 50s and the 60s. They should have around, 75% humidity in the daytime and around 100% humidity in the nighttime. So, Nepenthes being from tropical rainforests, they need high humidity. And ways you can do this is, if you're growing on the windowsill, you can put moss, or you really should have moss in the pots, or you can have moss, surrounding to help increase ambient humidity. The closer, the more plants you have, that'll also help increase ambient humidity. And you can put them raised above in water trays, or in per se stones that have water, and as that water evaporates, it will increase the ambient humidity. Another great option if you're growing indoors is with a terrarium. And for example, I used repurposed aquariums. They were great. I just built little DIY styrofoam platforms to make sure the water can drain properly, and it works great. It being enclosed in this glass box really helps increase and maintain this ambient humidity, and I found great success. Before I was growing on the windowsill, and I didn't get too many pictures. But when I moved to the terrarium and these aquariums, tons of pictures. And, in my opinion, the best option, if you have the money and the space, is to invest in a grow tent. Now, with the grow tent, you can keep much more plants and much larger plants than in a terrarium. And, you can also have light fixtures installed in the grow tent, and you can really increase that humidity. For instance, I have a large Nepenthes alata. However, it doesn't have any pictures because the ambient humidity is not high enough, and I'm not able to get it into a humid environment because of its size. Next, let's move on to lighting. Now, Nepenthes should have 12 to 14 hours of bright indirect light. So how can this be done? Well, you can use a sunny windowsill or a grow light. Both are great options. Next up is potting medium. So a great potting medium, which I use and many online resources also use, is a mixture of sphagnum moss, perlite, and cocoa husk. Now, resources I've seen say a 1 part perlite to 2 parts sphagnum to 1 part cocoa husk. However, when I'm making my mixture, it's not the most exact thing. Sphagnum is a great base because you want this to be, moisture retentive, you want it to be moist, but you want it to be able to drain properly. Because if your soil media does not drain properly, you are going to get root rot and your plant will die. Conversely, with some other carnivorous plants like Sarracenia, you can use a peat moss, but for Nepenthes, you would want to use sphagnum moss. Additionally, if you're using cocoa husk, you want to make sure that you leach it because it can be salty, and try to leach it to where it's been below 40 parts per million. Next up is watering. So watering is very important when you are growing Nepenthes. And why is this? Well, you don't want to be using water that has a lot of minerals or nutrients in it. For example, you don't want to be using spring water. The 3 best options for Nepenthes is distilled water, reverse osmosis water, or rainwater. Now, ideally, your ppm should be under 10 is perfect. That is like, the golden ticket. Under 50 is also a good benchmark. It's still, a good solid range, a healthy range. Some plants may also tolerate between 100 to 200 ppm. But, the lower the ppm, the better. Next, top watering is best to prevent potential oversaturation of the soil and root rot. Because if you're bottom watering, like you might do for other bog carnivorous plants, with Nepenthes, if you bottom water, it might, soak the soil and your plant may get root rot. So top watering is the best, and just let that water soak through and, drain out at the bottom of the pot. And finally, for humidity, some options. So you can just use, a handheld spray bottle with, that clean, low ppm water. You can use a fogger, a humidifier, or using a terrarium, really helps increase ambient humidity. Alright, next up is feeding. So personally, I don't feed my Nepenthes. They're just sustained off the bugs in my house, quite honestly. Little fruit flies, little mosquitoes. I look in the pictures and there's bugs. But with that being said, you can feed the pitchers bi-weekly with, dead or live bugs, fish food, or cricket powder. And you can also, instead of that, you could do foliar feeding, meaning like you spray the leaves with a Max C mixture at 300 ppm once per month. Or, additionally, you can put 1 Osmocote pellet in pitchers monthly. Finally, we got some pruning tips. So, with pruning, you can chop off fully black or brown pitchers that have already dried up or died, but you don't want to be clipping pitchers that still have a little bit of color to them and that are still partially alive. So if the top part is dead but the bottom half is still alive, you don't want to snip off that pitcher because it's still beneficial to the plant and you could be causing unnecessary damage and stress. Alright, so finally, here are just some great resources that I found along my journey of keeping Nepenthes. First up is Windowsill Nepenthes. Amazing channel on YouTube. Extremely knowledgeable. Really, easy to understand explanations. Fantastic channel. Go check out Windowsill Nepenthes. Next up, Carnivoro. This is the company which I personally buy my Nepenthes from and my carnivorous plants. I've never had an issue. Even when I live here in PA and it's being shipped from Texas. Fantastic customer service, fantastic quality of plants, overall awesome company, and they have fantastic tips and tricks on their website. And finally, here's a book that I found really useful. It's called The Savage Garden, revised by Peter D'Amato. And, this covers all sorts of carnivorous plants. I highly recommend reading it. Very interesting, very informative, and it has all the info you could wish for when, talking about keeping carnivorous plants. So, that's all for today. Thank you so much for watching. I'll catch you on the next one.